I thought that I was going to kind of talk a little bit about myself, just how I got here from academia, but for the interest of time, and I don't really want to bore you, essentially I did my PhD at McGill, did a postdoc at University of Montreal, and then essentially moved into business by just looking for opportunities and keeping an open mind and always staying versatile and always learning, and then just kind of migrating towards those opportunities. So I won't say much more than that. So what exactly am I going to cover today? There are four main points that I'm going to cover here. First, I'm going to give kind of a brief overview and some highlights from the regenerative medicine sector. I think these are kind of interesting little tidbits. Some of the principles in terms of driving company value. I'm going to go through some of the components of a valuation, specifically something called a risk-adjusted net present value valuation, and then just in general some tips to consider when you're launching your startup business. So I'm really going to kind of go through these slides quickly. This is just to highlight that there's a lot of capital that's currently flowing into the RM sector. You can see that to date there's almost about $1 billion that's been raised through IPOs in RM companies. You can see that venture capital has invested about $2 billion to date. And then in the M&A side of things, about $17.8 billion, highlighted by these notable acquisitions here. Astellas acquiring Universal Cells for $100 million, Celgene acquiring Juno for about $10 billion, Novartis acquiring Avexis for $8.7 billion, and then Takeda and Tygenix for around $600 million. So there's a lot of money going around right now. This is kind of a breakdown of the previous slide, but it's just highlighting the fact that to date there's about $3.7 billion that's been invested from angel and VC groups, and you can see that RM in advanced therapies continues to be a growing segment of the entire biotech financings. You can also see that IPOs are on pace to surpass 10-year highs right now, and about $1.44 billion has been raised in about 11 IPOs to date. And when you look at the public markets, you can really see that this is just looking at cellular immunotherapies. You can really see that the magenta line here showing that in this cellular immunotherapy index, it's really outperforming other biotechnology indices, including the NASDAQ Biotechnology and S&P Biotechnology Index. What this is really showing is that the promise of large returns in RM is really getting people excited and driving down the cost of capital. So all of this excitement, what is it leading to? It's leading to high company valuations and large deal sizes. And you can see the dark blue bar here showing the median valuation, post-money valuation of RM companies is up around $155 million, which far eclipses around $60 million for the rest of biotech. And the average deal size is, the median deal size is around $13 million. So you can see at the bottom here some examples. Rubius Therapeutics being valued at about $1.8 billion, Orchard Therapeutics being valued at about $746 million, Allogene being valued at $686 million, and AvroBio at $439 million. So, there's a lot of money going around, and a lot of these companies are being valued very, very highly. So, three key questions kind of come about from this. Where do these high valuations come from? What exactly do these valuations mean? How does valuation help the strategic development planning? So I think to answer these questions, you really need to kind of go back and you have to ask, why exactly is valuation important? So valuation is something that's super important in biotechnology. It's really used for all aspects of investment, M&A, development strategy, and licensing. And value is really a key question in development in biotechnology. And there are many reasons for this. One is that the industry lacks a lot of transparency. You don't really know how much dollars, or companies aren't revealing how many dollars are going into their development because they're private companies. Their assets have high levels of uncertainty. There are high levels of risk associated with these assets. Long development times, long investment cycles. There's a lack of clarity into the future market. Like 10 years from now, can you really predict with any sort of clarity what the market is going to look like? Complex IP and technology situations, as you learned this morning. But of course, with all this high risk and high uncertainty, there's high upside potential for investors. And you can see biotechnology companies with a 90% probability of failure can return upwards of 50%, per year. So how exactly are products or companies valued? There are many methods, ranging from operations-based methods to market-based, looking at trends and comparisons. And there's really no right method. So when you look at a valuation, there's really like a big range. Here is just a list of some methods that are used, like an EBITDA multiple, discounted cash flows, this risk-adjusted net present value that I'll talk about a little bit, real options, which really go into sort of the opportunity cost. Venture capital really looks at exit values, and then of course there are comparables. And when you look at biotechnology companies, in particular therapeutics companies, they oftentimes have no near horizon revenues, and value is really defined by the potential of the future compared to the cost today and the associated risk that it's going to take to get there. So the value drivers of this are really the management team, the market, science and technology, stage of the company, all the things that Julia and Fred talked about, how they're important in terms of your thinking for your business, are very, very important in the eyes of the investor, because this is what really drives the uncertainty as to whether they're going to make an investment or not. So if we just jump into a risk-adjusted net present value, you can see that there are like 5 main stages in terms of developing one of these. And I just want to direct your attention to the top right graph first. What you're looking at here is projected cash flows over time. And these are really broken down into 2 phases. You have a development phase where all the dollars are going in to fund the development of the project, and then a market phase. Once you get reimbursement, once you get approval, and then you start getting revenues from hitting the market. And what happens is that what you do is in the first stage, you calculate all of the costs that you anticipate in the development phase. You calculate all of the revenues that you expect in the market phase, and this goes, really speaks to what Fred was talking about in terms of the market. You're looking at the projected revenues from your sales. You really need to figure out what that TAM or TOM is in terms of your market penetration, and then you're going to compare that to your COGS. And then you're also going to look at decays due to patent expiry and then also the entrance of other competitors. And then what happens is when you have these cash flows, you have your free cash flows that you can calculate, and then you're going to discount these. And you're discounting them according to the time value of money. And the reason why there's a time value of money is because there's uncertainty with money. $100 today is not equal to $100 tomorrow, or even $1,000 tomorrow. Because if I have $100 in my wallet today, then it's 100% certain that I have $100 in my wallet today, which I don't. But $1,000, say tomorrow or a year from now, there's really no guarantee that you are going to get that $1,000 in the future. So that level of uncertainty is calculated in here, and that's calculated as the cost of capital as well as the development risk, the management, the competition, and the environment that I was talking about. And you can see that there's, the development or the discount is really according to the stage of the company where they are in development. After you've discounted, there's an additional reduction called a risk adjustment, and this is development-related risk. And this is associated with the fact that it's biotechnology, it needs to go through clinical trials, and there is going to be success and there's going to be attrition. And there's a certain level of this that happens, and it's well documented. So reducing down the value according to this risk adjustment lowers the overall value. And then when you sum up all of these discounted cash flows, risk-adjusted discounted cash flows, you get today's present-day valuation. Clear? Good. So just to talk a little bit about discounting. So, investors typically expect, like I said, kind of the sliding scale based on where you are. These are just generalizations. But what these percentages mean is that if an investor is investing $1 million today, they really expect to get, say, something like $28 million in about 15 years. Or, conversely, if a company is expected to be valued at $1 million in 15 years, it's really only worth $35,000 today if you discounted the cash flows back to the present day. So as an example, picture a company that's worth $2.3 billion in profit over 10 years. This is going to be seen as $127 million today in the eyes of an investor if you assume a 20% discount. In terms of development and approval risk, again, you're going to have a certain percentage of success and a certain percentage of attrition, and this is really just due to the fact that some technologies just don't work out. And this has been well documented, and what happens is that you take these percentages and then you reduce down. So if you return to the example, you take that 127, which was discounted from the 2.3, you adjust for development costs, and now it's really only worth $8 million today. So something that looked like this gargantuan is really only just this little tiny amount today. And this is really reflected when you look at the valuations and the price per share of, say, Kite and Juno. Here I'm making an overgeneralization, saying that the funding really corresponds, or the funding rounds really correspond with being used with next rounds of development in clinical trials. But you can see that every time that they fundraised, they had de-risked the asset, and the value of the technology, or the value of the company, went up each time. And this ultimately resulted in about a 114x return for initial investors in Kite, and a 22x return for Juno's investors, but over only a 3-year period, which is pretty awesome. So if you bring it all together, you calculate your revenues, you take out your cost of goods, take out your other expenses, you get your EBITDA, you get your net income when you take out your taxes, you get your free cash flow, which in this case here is $1.7 billion. You discount it 20% for uncertainties, brings you to $74 million, which means that when you risk adjust it according to an 8% cumulative probability of something going from preclinical to market approval, then it's worth around $5 million today. So, bringing this all together, I just want to conclude with some tips to consider when you are launching your startup business, considering this valuation stuff in your mind. So number one, when you build a development plan, make sure you build one that is really pushing towards these value inflections. A good development plan really builds investor value by de-risking the technology. Make sure that you have a plan that is aiming to de-risk the technology the way that the investor wants to see it done. You need to be aggressive, but you also need to be reasonable. Like Fred and Julia said, you got to build the key partnerships to help drive that program in parallel, not necessarily in sequence, but really helping to de-risk or mitigate risk. Remember the time value of money. Like a 2x return over 1 year is better than a 4x return over 5 years. Really, investors don't care if you're going to save them money. They really want to see that you're driving it forward as fast as possible, and if the technology is going to fail, then it's better that it fails fast so that they can move on to something else. Number two, be reasonable with your company valuations. So obviously, like Fred said, you guys get technologies and you think this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you say, okay, well, the market's going to be $10 billion, so my company is worth $1 billion today. And what happens is that when you overvalue your company like that, you end up inevitably increasing the exit valuation that's needed for an investor return. And if the exit multiple doesn't add up in the eyes of the investor, then they're just not going to invest. So you have to keep that in mind. Overvaluation also increases the likelihood that you could have a flat or a down round in the future, and that really can lessen the attractiveness of the venture to other investors to come on board, because it doesn't seem like value is being created. It just seems like you're puttering along or actually decreasing in value. And be accurate with your forecasting. This really speaks to what Fred was talking about at the end. It's very easy to missegment your market, overestimate your penetration rate, downplay the role of competitors. You really need to just kind of look at the overall market, and if you really understand it, you can really refine it down into the key market that you will be addressing. And then finally, don't be afraid of dilution. This is just to say that investors are really more than just large wallets. Investors can provide a lot of strategic support, a lot of management, and access to these networks that are so key, and key partnerships to driving you forward. And one thing that you really have to consider is you have to decide whether you want to have a slice of watermelon or a whole grape, right? Whether you want to be rich or you want to be the king. And I recommend that you read this Founder's Dilemma in the Harvard Business Review, where it kind of speaks to this. Obviously, equity is not something that you should just be handing out to anyone. It really needs to make sense. Equity is really something that's really, really strong. It's a strong asset that you need to hold on to. But when the right partner comes and they can bring you the right network or the right management, then it makes sense, to have them invest, get diluted, but then you're going to drive that forward. And to kind of give two examples here, I pulled this data from PitchBook on two comparable companies. Company A was founded in 2016. The founder had about 35% equity in the company at founding. A little while later, just later that year, they raised their Series A from two large VC firms in the Boston area. The founder got crunched down to 6.5%, but their post-money valuation was $50 million, and his value sat around $3.2 million. Then over a series of other investments, and finally an IPO in 2018, he got whittled down to around 3%, but the valuation of their company at that time was $515 million, which meant that his 3% equaled about $20 million in paper. Now, if you look at Company B, this company was founded in 2014. The founder had 45% at that time, refused to be diluted, refused to partner, eventually raised an angel round just to get some money in. He got diluted down to 40% at a $50 million valuation, and that brought him down to $20 million, or brought him to $20 million in paper value. Now, there are some key differences here. One difference is that for Company A, really there was a lot of value that was being generated over this time. The company is now valued at $515 million, but it's a publicly traded market, or publicly traded company, which means that the investors, or some of the early investors, can now exit that. They can actually realize their investment. So the 20 million of his, he could actually realize some of that. He was also getting paid at the time because they had money to pay him. So it does not include his annual salary, which was around $600,000 when you look at base and incentive. And then I think the real telling thing is the fact that the cash on hand, Company A has $150 million cash on hand, whereas Company B only has about $1 million right now. And this is really, really important because right now the market is up, cash is accessible, so it's a good time to get the cash when you can. When the market eventually corrects itself, what's going to happen is that Company A will be able to weather this storm. Company B will run out of money. They'll probably have trouble raising more money because the market will be down, and then they may eventually die, meaning that the 40% of nothing will be nothing. So to summarize, biotech market is hot right now. Shrinking R&D expenditures and significant cash by pharma are really boosting M&A activity. There are a lot of approvals and continued positive clinical data, which is really keeping investors interested in cell and gene therapies. There's a lot of good access to capital right now, so it's a good time to be raising when it's available, not when it's needed. And this activity is really driving company valuations and deal sizes upwards. There are a lot of different ways to value a company. We looked at the risk adjustment and discounting methods which are used. And then the three tips that I have are just make sure that your development plan is focused on removing risks and driving value creation. Don't overvalue your assets. Make sure you leave room for investors to come in who can bring in those networks and help you if you need it. And also don't be afraid of dilution. Remember that equity is a powerful asset, but you have to ask yourself if you want to have just a slice of watermelon or a grape, right? So with that, I'll end. Thank you.